Now let's introduce the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg.
大家好，我现在在北京，我爱这里。我的中文很糟糕，但是我的天，学用中文。
Now, a lot of people pilloried Mark Zuckerberg for this speech. They said he, quote, spoke like a 7-year-old. Now, we're gonna get into how good Mark Zuckerberg's Chinese actually is, but I find this type of talk to be really infuriating. You find me, a 7-year-old who creates a multi-billion-dollar tech company, gets invited to speak at China's most prestigious university, and then proceeds to give a 30-minute-long Q&A in fluent Mandarin on topics ranging from China's economy to the importance of artificial intelligence. And I'll show you a 7-year-old who doesn't exist. I get it. Some of you journalists have really good Chinese, but this guy built a billion-dollar tech company and you did it.
我觉得学习语言帮助我学习文化。
Okay, I think that the reason that a lot of these people, particularly Americans, give Zuckerberg so much flack for speaking Mandarin is that he does have a very thick American accent. He uses very typical American English intonation when he's speaking Chinese. When you take that sentence in English, I feel like studying the language helps me understand the culture, and you try to put it into Mandarin using English intonation, what you get is something like what Zuckerberg just said. 我觉得学习语言帮助我学习文化. I feel like studying the language helps me understand the culture, whereas a native Chinese speaker would have said something more closely resembling 我觉得学习语言帮助我学习文化. And the problem here is that standard English intonation, the way that we speak sentences, can interfere with the tones of the Chinese language. So when you want to say the word for culture in Chinese, which is 文化, right? The second and fourth tone. 文化, 文化, like a roller coaster. 文化. If you pronounce it like the way we pronounce the English word culture in this sentence, I feel like studying the language helps me understand the culture, right? Because we're emphasizing the word culture as contrasted with the word language. You end up with something like what Zuckerberg says, 文化, 学习文化, culture. The emphasis ends up being off because Zuckerberg is thinking in English and not Chinese. And this happens whenever you learn a foreign language, but it's a little bit more awkward in Chinese because Chinese has these tones that can't be overridden by the intonation of the sentence. So no matter whether you're saying culture, 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 however we say it in English, whenever you say the word culture in Chinese, it always has to be 文化, 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 文化. Like however you emphasize it, the tones have to be there. So I can understand how Americans who speak good Chinese can look at Zuckerberg, what Zuckerberg's saying, and like, oh, what a chump. He can't even pronounce the word for culture correctly. The dude's accent is terrible. But let's do a little thought experiment, right? Could you imagine if a major Chinese CEO came to the United States and gave a speech in English with a very thick Chinese accent, and major American newspapers proceeded to describe his enunciation as, quote, roughly on par with the clarity possible when someone's stepping on your face. Now, that would probably be described as racist, and rightly so, quite possibly by the very same journalists who are giving Zuckerberg so much flack for his accent when speaking Chinese. Keep in mind how ecstatic the Chinese people in the audience were to hear Zuckerberg speaking in Mandarin. The people criticizing his pronunciation are American, not Chinese. The audience can see how much time and effort he spent into learning this language, despite the fact that his pronunciation isn't perfect, and they love him for it. This is really a lesson in how much people appreciate it when you try and go learn their language, even if you're not perfect. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I love learning languages personally.
我觉得清华的学生很好。
Another issue with Zuckerberg's Mandarin is that his pronunciation of consonants and vowels is a little bit off, like very typically American pronunciation.
我觉得清华的学生很好。
Versus 我觉得清华的学生很好. Now, when Americans learn Chinese, when really anybody learns Chinese, you have to start with romanization because you can't really read from the characters directly, at least not initially. There's a standardized way to write Chinese with Latin letters called pinyin. A lot of Americans, when they learn Chinese, can be kind of misled. So for example, very good in Chinese is 很好, right? But it's written in Chinese as H-E-N S-H-A-O. Now, if I showed the average American these two words, most people, I guess, would probably say something like hen hao. It's close enough to the pronunciation of the Chinese to be intelligible, but it isn't quite what a native speaker would sound like. Hen hao, hen hao. But it's hard to write that Chinese pronunciation with Latin letters. There's really no way to transcribe it accurately. So you have to use the closest approximation to what Latin letters can represent when you're trying to write Chinese. So that's what they picked, but it ends up leading a lot of Americans astray.
帮助中国人用互联网。今天大部分世界65%差不多50亿人没有互联网。
So you've really gotta hand it to him. You know, he's got pretty decent vocabulary and grammar. Like, he's able to talk about a lot of sophisticated stuff, all while being the CEO of one of the biggest companies on the planet. And yes, his pronunciation of duo, he pronounces it like duo. And zh, he pronounces G. But like, he's putting in the effort, okay? And you also have to give him credit that a year later in 2015, he goes back to Tsinghua.
当时我们不知道这些问题的答案，没有人知道。
So yes, he still has that like typical American pronunciation, but his tones are much better, his pronunciation is much better. His grammar is actually really good and really impressive for somebody who's only spent a year or two learning Mandarin. And he delivers this speech in a very natural way that actually sounds kind of good. And then a year later in 2016, Zuckerberg returns to this scene with another video in Chinese. This time it's a Chinese New Year message, interestingly also featuring his wife Priscilla speaking Chinese.
大家好，新年快乐！今年能和 Max 一起庆祝新年，我和 Priscilla 非常兴奋。
我们希望你也正在和你的家人朋友一起庆祝。
Oh, their baby is so cute, by the way. And they actually asked Mark about this back in 2014.
你和 Priscilla 谁的中文更好？
但是用普通话我能说更多次，但是他也说广东话，他的听力比我的听力更好，我的听力很差，一天我问他为什么我的听力这么差，他告诉我你的听力用英文也差。
That's pretty funny. You can definitely tell that her Mandarin sounds more natural than Mark's, with great tones on words like 家人朋友. But it also doesn't sound like she's a native speaker based on the way that she pronounces certain consonants, like how she pronounces 正在,
正在
which is more like 正在 in standard Mandarin. Although this is actually a clue that she's probably more comfortable speaking in another Chinese dialect than Mandarin, because most Americans wouldn't make that mistake when speaking Mandarin. And it's really not surprising because according to Wikipedia, her parents are actually Chinese Vietnamese, and she grew up in America. So my guess is probably that she spoke more Vietnamese or Cantonese with her parents growing up. Really because Chinese immigrants to Southeast Asia are often from southeastern China, where people tend to speak different Chinese languages like Cantonese or Fujianese instead of Mandarin. So I actually think it would have been really interesting had she spoken her part in this video in Cantonese rather than Mandarin, but for some reason they chose to do the whole thing in Mandarin. So I really hope you guys all enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in checking out some of my language courses, including my Chinese course, make sure to check out the link in the description or just go to streetsmartlanguages.com to check it out.